On behalf of the Charles Darwin Foundation, I would like to welcome everyone on this webinar with Professor Bill Durham. The webinar today is titled What Darwin Found Convincing in Galapagos. So it is great to see so many people joining from all over the world. My name is Lisa. I have been with the Charles Darwin Foundation for over 7 years now, working as part of the fundraising team. And it's been a very amazing experience working alongside so many scientists and accomplished academics. And one of those is Bill Durham, who has been a longtime friend, advocate, and supporter of the Galapagos and of the Charles Darwin Foundation. He's being Professor Emeritus in Human Biology and Anthropology at Stanford University and one of the leading experts on these topics. And in this webinar, he will explore the important experiences Darwin had on the Beagle voyage, which helped him notice the mockingbirds in Galapagos and eventually led him to his theory of evolution. If you have any questions during the webinar, please put them in the Q&A box below. We'll answer as many or as all at the end of the webinar. So I will block the box now, the chat box now, so we have all the questions in one spot. So it's easier for us to see everything. And also, just one last note, in the spirit of Giving Tuesday next week, I'm putting in the chat box now a link to our special campaign, our year-end campaign that we do every year at the Charles Darwin Foundation. So if you feel inspired during this talk and want to contribute to this campaign, you can do so on this link. So to not take more time, Bill, the floor is yours. You can share your screen, I think. And we can dive in.
Very good.
I see it. I think it works well.
Good morning and welcome, everyone. It's great to have you here. Thanks for joining our webinar for the Charles Darwin Foundation. We hope you'll agree it's a natural selection for today. Because we commemorate today the 166th anniversary of the publication on November 24th, 1859, you have already guessed it, of Darwin's big book on the origin of species. On the origin of species by means of natural selection or the preservation of favored races. Let me make my screen a little more visible here. Favored races in the struggle for life. By Charles Darwin, M.A. Did you know he had an M.A.? You automatically got an M.A. in those days when you had an A.B. degree or a B.A. degree from Cambridge and paid a fee a couple of years afterwards. You automatically got your M.A. I always thought that was fascinating. So today I want to talk about the origin of this book, the origin of On the Origin, in a talk that I call, as Lisa's already mentioned, What Darwin Found Convincing in Galapagos, because Galapagos was so pivotal to Darwin's discovery of evolution during the voyage of the Beagle, well, after the voyage of the Beagle. Now I have to get my machinery to cooperate with me here. There we go. Okay. We'll ask this morning, what led Darwin to reject the prevalent view of life at the time as a product of special creation and instead propose a truly revolutionary theory? We'll take a fresh look at the evidence leading Darwin to discover evolution, the proposition that all the diverse species of life are connected by unbroken ties of descent to one common origin, as you can see in this enlargement of the diagram from Darwin's own book on the origin of species, the letters representing diverse species. Looking back later on his own writing, Darwin said he had two distinct objects in view writing on the origin of species. Firstly, to show that species had not been separately created, that they had, in fact, this chain of connection going all the way back in this big tree of life to the species in which Darwin said life was first breathed. And secondly, to show that natural selection had been the chief agent of change. Notice he doesn't say it's the only agent of change, it's the main but not exclusive means of modification, as he put it. So we speak today and recognize Darwin as the leading author, together with Alfred Russel Wallace, of the theory of evolution by natural selection. As you know, there was no eureka moment in Galapagos, and in fact, Darwin summarizes this for us in the opening sentence of On the Origin of Species, the very first sentence of the very first page. He says, "When on board the HMS Beagle as naturalist, I was much struck with certain facts in the spatial distribution of the inhabitants of South America, including Galapagos, as we'll see in that designation, and in the temporal relations of the present to the past inhabitants of that continent. These facts," says Darwin, "seem to me to throw some light on the origin of species." And so this is a very nice summary of what we're about to look at in Darwin's very concise wording. So my outline is to examine how discoveries on the HMS Beagle led Darwin to evolution, to show how fossils, foxes, feathers, and Fuegians, the four Fs, fossils, foxes, feathers, and Fuegians, prepped him for Galapagos, where because of those, of all things, mockingbirds gave him important clues. And back from the voyage, back in England, with the help of the ornithologist John Gould, on Darwin's mockingbirds, it led him to discover the tree of life. So that's my outline for this morning. Now, Darwin had just finished his A.B. degree at Cambridge in 1831, when his mentor John Henslow at Cambridge, the botany professor that Darwin took his class 3 times, I believe, wrote Charles. They got to be sort of acquaintances and conversation partners and so on. Henslow wrote Darwin about the opportunity to be a companion to Robert Fitzroy, who was captain at the time of the HMS Beagle. Darwin had to survive an interview with Fitzroy. He had to survive his father's initial opposition. He got through both of those and departed in late December of 1831. On a voyage that was supposed to last 2 years and ended up lasting 5, in part because of its mission and in part because Fitzroy was so compulsively thorough and complete. So this was voyage number 2 of the HMS Beagle. It turns out there was an earlier voyage that we'll talk about momentarily. It sailed between 1831 and 1836 when Darwin was between 22 and 27 years of age. And its mission was to map the waters around Tierra del Fuego, to survey harbors where damaged boats could safely stop to make repairs, survey the Galapagos Islands for sources of potable water, and then, of course, to get great accuracy for the Royal Navy. All this was, the charter was from the Royal Navy, from the Admiralty, and it all had to be done very carefully. So Fitzroy took an incredible 22 chronometers to determine the longitude with accuracy. But there was another reason for the second voyage of the Beagle. Captain Fitzroy sought to return 4 Native Americans that he and crew had captured on the first Beagle voyage, which was back in 1826 to 1830, 5-6 years before the voyage we're going to focus on today. So there was a first Beagle voyage we'll talk about more in just a minute. So how did an expedition designed for the Royal Navy for very different purposes lead Darwin to evolution? In a word, my thesis would be this: driven by his own curiosity, the voyage led Darwin to 3 curious anomalies and to a 4th key insight that we'll talk about. An anomaly I'm going to speak today is an observation that is unexpected by the theory or by the view of special creation, that life had been specially and separately created, each species, and had remained fixed through time. So anomalies are observations that are unexpected by that thesis. What anomalies were there as the Beagle set sail? What anomalies were there to special creation in 1831? Well, not very many, for the obvious reason that people could say, oh, but the creator wanted such and such the way it is. And that's an easy way to defend the theory. About the only noteworthy anomaly that might really cause people to pause was suggested by Darwin's own grandfather, Erasmus. You'll remember, in Zoonomia, he argued that the common bone structure, quote, of all warm-blooded animals showed them to be related, not separately created, implying that there was some kind of organic connection between them. Human, horse, bird, let me get my cursor working for me here. Human, horse, bird, bat, and seal all show comparable bones in the same place, what we call today a homologous bone structure. This was not lost on Erasmus, and he suggested this implied a certain relationship, not special creation. So what anomalies did the young Darwin find to challenge special creation? I will argue that the Beagle voyage brought him face to face with three new anomalies influenced by the geologist Charles Lyell, contemporary but an older gentleman to Charles Lyell, who suggested that the Earth was quite ancient, and in his Principles of Geology, which Darwin had access to, in fact, Fitzroy gave him volume 1, and he picked up 2 and 3 during the voyage of the Beagle, helped Darwin to notice 2 of his 3 big anomalies even before the ship reached Galapagos. But it took Galapagos, I will argue, to make them convincing. In other words, Galapagos becomes the pivot, becomes the turning point in the whole situation. So let's begin by looking at Darwin's Beagle data before Galapagos. They were again fossils, feathers of the rhea, foxes, and Fuegians, I will argue. Much of this is review for you all. At some point in careers, we've all been through this, so let me move right along. For full details, you might want to look at my chapter in the Wolf and Gardner 2012 Role of Science for Conservation, the 50th anniversary volume for the Charles Darwin Foundation. What was the secret to begin with? Let's take a look at the secret to Darwin's success in all this. There are many views and many things that could be said, but certainly he was a careful, relentless observer going back to his days collecting beetles. He was a voracious reader, including the Beagle's extensive library, some of which he brought aboard, but it was quite an amazing library, as shown by, well, he knew where to look for the megafaunal fossils when it came to the coast of South America. He knew that the French explorer d'Orbigny had failed to catch an interesting bird, the lesser rhea, that he, Darwin, was determined to find. And seasickness, he, was constantly seasick during the sailing time of the Beagle, and so that meant he scampered on land every time he could, which contributed to his observations of geology, zoology, botany, and so on. But also, I will argue, made Darwin a wee bit more of a social scientist than we normally give him credit for being. He was a keen observer and a keen philosopher, a thinker of human customs, among them the indigenous Fuegians we'll talk about, the Maori of New Zealand, the Aborigines of Australia as shown here. So much so I can recommend this book to you in an unqualified manner. It's a book on the ethnography of Charles Darwin, a study of the writings that pulled them together, mostly Darwin's, but also Fitzroy and other authors, crewmen and so on, observations from the voyage of the Beagle that Darwin did a lot with, as we'll summarize this morning. So let's begin with his first major discovery in 1833, Darwin's fossils. In Uruguay and also in the coast of Argentina, he had major luck finding fossils of the past. On the Atlantic coast outside Montevideo, he found many mollusks like the ones shown here. He found near here 23 species of fossil shells. You can see in this matrix of limestone, of which he discovered 17 of the 23, 74% still live in the area. In other words, they're still in the water line, they're still in the ocean just off the coast. That's an impressive number to be alive from what he inferred from Lyell to be millennia, millions of years perhaps. These were mollusks. Many of them appeared to have persisted unchanged across very long periods of time. Darwin wrote, "The fossils appear to me to be exactly the same species which now exist on the beach. And it is to be especially remarked, with his emphasis, that the proportional numbers of each species are about the same. The most abundant in both cases are so and so and so and so the rarest." So in other words, Darwin is looking at these fossils he's finding and discovering that they're very closely related, both in number and in apparently species, genus and species, to what he's finding today. A little further down the east coast in Argentina, at a place called Bahia Blanca, it was a very different story told by the fossils. Darwin found remains of a giant glyptodon that did not persist across time. He found these curious polygonal plates you can see here on the left. You can see these interesting shapes of these polygonal plates, some like bones and so on. of what he inferred were the carapace of the giant Glyptodon. It had been reported by others, and he just did his reading and knew where to find them, and in fact did find them. So this exoskeleton or carapace of the Glyptodon was a very impressive structure, over a meter in length. In celebration, he wrote to Henslow, again his Cambridge mentor, a letter also on this day, November 24th, from Montevideo. I've been very lucky with fossil bones. In one formation, I found a large surface of osseous polygonal plates, which late observations, quoting, show belong to the Glyptodon. Well, he's showing off here to his mentor. This is a quote from Edwin Pidgeon in a work that Darwin brought along on the voyage. Immediately, he said, when I saw them, I thought they must belong to an enormous armadillo, living species of which genus are so abundant here. So up above on the step, there were all of these armadillos. And Darwin said, gosh, it looks for all the world like the giant extinct Glyptodon has been replaced by the extant armadillos of the Pampas. Well, he may have had that idea in his head, and it took some more evidence to firmly convince him that there was something to this. He found a second fossil specimen in Bahia Blanca, a very large caviomorph rodent fossil, a cavy fossil, as indicated by its incisors. As you know, in caviomorph rodents, the incisors grow incessantly. They just keep growing. And of course, that's why, so many squirrels in your backyard have to keep gnawing on your deck or whatever it is. And also by the elevated ankle, he recognized that this was a caviomorph rodent. And he said, my goodness, it looks as though it's replaced by today's little Patagonian cavy, sort of a rabbit-sized, jackrabbit-sized animal that lives up above these terrace areas where he found the fossils. Finally, Darwin found many other fossils, but the other one I will name, he found large teeth without much enamel. And this was a signal that he'd found the teeth of a megatherium. Megatheria had been discovered widely at the time. Even Cuvier had found some in the basin of Paris. These were giant ground sloths, and he had a jaw with teeth that Darwin did. He sent it back. They were reconstructed to look like this. Darwin did not find the skeleton or the specimen. This is in a museum, but I just wanted to show you. You can see it had 3 toes on the feet. And Darwin said, this looks for all the world in the structure of its teeth like the living sloths that are up in the patchy forest patches up above the cliffs where he found the fossils. So it again looks like the megatherium is replaced by today's much smaller living sloths. So Darwin had 3 curious replacements. This is really quite special, summarized by Niles Eldridge. He found an extinct Glyptodon that seems to be replaced today by living armadillo species, an extinct giant ground sloth replaced today seemingly by living sloth species, and an extinct cavy replaced today by the Patagonian cavy, much smaller. At the same time, he found the fossil mollusks that persisted across time, just went right on through that time span implied from the work of Lyell and others, that represented by the strata in which these fossils were found. And so Darwin says this: the most important result of this discovery is that existing animals have a close relation in form with extinct species. I'll call it a succession of types, he wrote. But since the mollusks did not change over time in the same place, Darwin went on, he was tempted to believe in such simple processes as variation of climate and food, or of the introduction of enemies, or the increased number of species as the cause of the succession for the terrestrial organisms. Because again, the mollusks were kind of the control that showed that didn't happen everywhere, leading Darwin to suspect natural causes. This is, of course, written after he returned, the narrative of the surveying voyages in 1839, and many of you know what we're about to review this morning had already led him to have suspicions of an evolutionary theory of life. So my point right now is that anomaly number 1, we call it replacement in time. The bigger megafauna of the past are replaced by smaller versions today, the succession of types, replacement in time. Darwin had a second major discovery, again, fleeing the boat because of seasickness and taking off with the gauchos. He really was something of a social scientist, open to these explorations, open to the technologies, open to the means of hunting and fishing and so on by the locals. And they took him out to hunt for the rheas, these ostrich-like animals. They're ratites, of course, but we won't get into that this morning. In August of 1833, the Gauchos described to Darwin a small rhea that lives in southern Patagonia. He had indeed heard about it. They call it the small ostrich. They actually called it an ostrich because it looks like an ostrich. It's a very close relative, obviously coming back from the connections at Gondwana land. Avestruz patis is the sort of bastardized Spanish for a small ostrich. The earlier French discoverer that Darwin had sort of an implied competition with. He'd mentioned it, but it was really only hearsay for him. He didn't produce a specimen. So Darwin was determined to find one, and he went out with the gauchos day after day looking for one, but they proved elusive. In the first days of January in 1834, Beagle artist Martins went hunting for the dinner for the crew and came back with some game. And in the middle of eating it, Darwin said, "Stop, everybody, put down your forks. It's the little rhea I've been looking for." And they said, "Oh, come on, man, we need our dinner." He had another dinner prepared, much to the complaints of the crew. And he saved every piece, every feather, every bone. It was the little rhea. He sent the pieces back to England, and it became known, at least temporarily, as Rhea darwini, named for Charles. The locals, moreover, told Darwin that the small rhea is basically the only rhea found south of the Rio Negro, which suggested not only why Darwin had such trouble finding it farther north, but it suggested that the greater rhea, the American rhea in the north, is replaced by the lesser rhea, now Darwin's rhea, in the south, another case of replacement, but this time it's replacement in space. In other words, this is a second anomaly. Why would the creator put another smaller rhea south of this natural boundary? And Darwin saw that as a bit of an enigma. Today, we might look at a map and say that people told him the Rio Negro is the dividing line between the American rhea to the north, the lesser rhea to the south, a replacement in space. Too bad Darwin didn't see Rothschild's rhea. He might certainly have been fascinated by that. But here's the situation. On the left is the Rhea Americana, replaced by the Rhea Pinnata, Darwin's rhea, down below the Rio Negro, south of the Rio Negro. The ship sailed on to Las Malvinas, or the Falkland Islands, where they could tell that there were two very different islands. There's the East Falkland Island and the West Falkland, and a lot of little islets around. And while they were there, the crew brought to Darwin representatives of the wolf-like fox, as it's often called, two different fox morphs, one from the eastern island and one from the west, and they had different color and subtle feature differences. Darwin wondered, is this another replacement in space? And it turns out he was to write about that later in his journals on the beagle. But this would be another case of the rhea-like replacement in space, with the one rhea, the bigger one, to the north and one to the south. This would be on these two different islands. So this was suggestive of anomaly number two. There are two foxes in the Falklands, and they are different. One replaces the other on the other island. But it also hinted at a third anomaly. He picked up a little bit of this on the Cape Verde Islands, but didn't think much about it or write much about it. They resemble the mainland fox over in Argentina, but not completely. And he wrote, "There's no other instance in zoology of so small a mass of broken land, the Falklands, distant from a continent about 285 miles, possessing so large a quadruped peculiar to itself, and indeed in two forms." Well, we know today that it was during the last ice age, roughly 16, 20,000 years ago. The ice sheets grew to an extent that the distance out from the ice sheets from the coast of Argentina to the Malvinas or Falkland Islands was indeed something a fox could easily scamper over. Darwin didn't know any of that, but he noticed the resemblance and let it sit there. So what did Darwin have so far? Two anomalies and a third possibility. Two anomalies and a third possibility. Replacement in time is suggested by the glyptodon, the giant ground sloth, and the extinct large caviomorph rodent. How do we know that Darwin thought this first anomaly was important? Well, he tells you so. This wonderful relationship in the same continent between the dead and the living will, I do not doubt, hereafter throw more light on the appearance of organic beings on our Earth and their disappearance from it than any other class of facts. Now, this was again written in 1839. He's saying to the world, this has a lot to do with the appearance of organic beings on our Earth, but I'm not going to get into that. I'm just going to tell you that this has a lot to do with it, as had been his experience with this thesis of replacement in time. More to do with the history of life on Earth than any other class of facts. Number two, replacement in space, as suggested by the two rhea species and by the wolf-like foxes of the East and West Falklands. And finally, a hint of a possible third anomaly, the affinity of Falkland foxes and of also vegetation in Cape Verde Islands, which I alluded to but haven't shown this morning. The affinity of Falkland foxes to the mainland, the affinity of islands to the local mainland in their flora and fauna, not the same morphology, but quite similar. There's still one more influential feathered species from South America we'll be back to momentarily, but I want to take a digression following the chronology of the voyage of the Beagle. So let's move on to this other important part of the voyage in Tierra del Fuego. This is a map all the way down to the Cape Horn, and you can see these are the indigenous populations of the area. They're the Yamana or Yaghan, as they're called, the Selknam or the Ona. Our point is not to dwell on the names of all the populations in the area, their ethnicity, but to signal that there's quite an ethnic diversity in the area, and to draw your attention to this island that's actually south of what's called the Beagle Channel. Did you know that on the 25th birthday of Charles Darwin, Fitzroy named Mount Darwin after him in honor of his 25th birthday? But as you cross the Beagle Channel there to this island, here, the Beagle visited Navarino Island in 1833 and 1834. They put in at the place where the finger is pointing out on Isla Navarino. Okay. Now, this example is not an anomaly. This is an important recognition, an important discovery, and I can only give us a look at the tip of the iceberg. Again, the book on Darwin's ethnography is well worth reading if you want more of the details. This is about the Native American Fuegians on board the second voyage of the Beagle. Here we see Darwin making observations akin to those of a social science. Of course, he spent almost 2 years in the company of the three Native Americans from Tierra del Fuego being returned. Only 3 of the 4 were still alive. They're called Fuegians after Tierra del Fuego, the land of fires, because of the campfires that they keep warm with at night. Now, the 4 Fuegians had been taken to England by Captain Fitzroy on that first Beagle voyage I alluded to, the voyage before Darwin, 1826 to 1830. And they were taken at that time in retaliation for a stolen dinghy, a little rowboat that was taken by the locals. They were quite into thievery, and there are many, many accounts of theft from visitors to the area. Well, he took them hoping to trade for the dinghy back, but the local folks weren't into that kind of trade, and no one showed any interest in trading relatives for dinghies. And so Fitzroy took them back, and he decided he would take them back to be schooled in Christianity, the better to be missions when brought back to their local land. He had made sure they were taught in a mission school. They were taught etiquette and manners, how to dress like the British dress, and they were taught the Queen's English. Fitzroy then took them to visit affluent families, including the king and queen at the time, dressed as proper British citizens, all dressed up. So here are the Fuegians, dressed for British social events. There's first Fuegia Basket, roughly 10 years of age. There's Jemmy Button, 14 years of age. There's York Minster, 26 years of age, the oldest of the 3. And the boy who died of smallpox, called Boat Memory, died of smallpox. And that was part of the reason that, in fact, Fitzroy felt pressured to return them. He didn't want to be responsible for more sickness or death. And there was yet another reason coming up. Eventually, York Minster took a romantic interest in the much younger Fuegia Basket, and this was going to be very embarrassing for Fitzroy, who had responsibility for these people. He pushed the Admiralty to hurry the second voyage of the Beagle to return them, and they agreed to an accelerated timeline. And what happened when the Fuegians were returned to Navarino had a very big impact on Darwin, as we'll see. Just in parenthesis, let me say that York Minster and Fuegia did marry on return to Navarino. In fact, it was a wedding hastily arranged by Fitzroy. And they had two children before York Minster was eventually killed by a rival group. There was great hostility among those different ethnicities in the region. So in December 1832, the Beagle first came into contact with Fuegians in their homeland. It was without exception the most curious and interesting spectacle I ever beheld. Darwin was actually somewhat frightened, somewhat uh, astonished that people could be so different. I would not have believed how entire the difference between savage and civilized man is. People came running to greet them with, nostrils dripping with nasal excretion and with bloody noses and yelling and screaming. And I mean, it was really quite the show. Living, of course, simply dressed in hides, as you can see here, and in simple wigwams made of collected logs in the background. Well, of course, it was Fitzroy's desire that the Beagle would establish a mission and that the people, the Fuegians, who had been to England and met the king and queen, would carry out that mission together with a young man on the ship. So a month later on Navarino, the crew built a mission consisting of three wooden wigwams, stores, and gardens. They actually cultivated the land, found a good place for cultivation, and they left this young missionary, Richard Matthews, behind. Fortunately, they saw enough warning signs, and believe me, there were many. I'm not going to get into them about pilfering, about theft, about even danger, that they turned around and came back to check on Matthews 2 weeks later. And it was terrible. He'd been stripped of everything. They had stolen most of his possessions, most of his clothing, and Matthews very willingly rejoined the crew to sail on with the Beagle. The They went back out to the Falklands. They went off and did more measurements for the Admiralty. They looked at more harbors and places to fix boats and so on. And they returned again a year later, and they found that Jemmy, who was kind of their favorite, had reverted back to his Yamana ways. In other words, he had gone back to the custom rather than maintaining his Christian etiquette training and so on. So in 1833, before they left him off, Jemmy Button was so particular about his clothes that he was always afraid of even dirtying his shoes, scarcely ever without gloves, and his hair neatly cut. He was quite the picture of a young British gent. In 1834, 1 year after they dropped the Fuegians in Navarino, it was quite painful, said Darwin, to behold him, thin, pale, and without a remnant of clothes, excepting a bit of blanket. And so ashamed of himself, he turned his back as the canoe approached. I never saw so complete and grievous a change. In other words, all that British training disappeared overnight, and he went back to sleeping like dogs around the fire, said Darwin. Fitzroy later wrote, he was wretchedly thin, his eyes were affected by smoke. We heard him below, clothed him immediately, and in half an hour he was sitting with me at dinner at my cabin using his knife and fork properly. So Darwin began to see culture was something that, comes and goes. It's a thin veneer. The Fuegians' cultural shifts were compelling to this nascent kind of scientist and partly social scientist. Cultural differences are a thin veneer. They come and go. They're neither long-lasting nor permanent. Cultural differences make humans seem so very different from place to place and time to time, but there's an underlying biological similarity that Darwin recognized because he felt compassion for them, as he also felt in his gut reactions to seeing a violent slave treatment in Brazil. Darwin recognized that he was feeling empathy for these people. He reasoned that our main differences are cultural. We are all one species of human beings. We'll be back to this. Following Darwin's logic, one could call this argument cultural replacement. We have replacement in space, replacement in time. We could speak of cultural replacement in space and time, and sometimes even in an individual's lifetime. Jemmy had cultural replacements up to the British culture and then back to Yamana culture almost without a skip. Now for the final piece of my argument, back to the voyage of the Beagle. We're now spending 1 year on the west coast of South America before heading out to Galapagos. And that 1 year gave Darwin a terrific preparation for what he was about to experience in Galapagos. They arrived in September of 1835 on Chatham Island, which we now call San Cristobal. And in Galapagos, Darwin saw many unusual organisms, of course, including the land iguanas and marine iguanas you all know about, including the Galapagos tortoises, of course, of their various carapace shapes. But Darwin was especially impressed by these mockingbirds, and it was for a good reason. For months, he had seen the Chilean mockingbird all up and down the coast of Chile as they made multiple stops, looking at multiple harbors, scampering ashore every time, even experiencing an earthquake. The Mimus thinca is the name of the Chilean mockingbird on the mainland of Chile in the southern cone of South America. Darwin wrote they're inquisitive, active, very fast, and they sing tolerably well, he allowed. Well, he has this image, the young Darwin on the right, has this image of a mainland mockingbird sort of in his head from this whole year of plying the shores of Chile. When he arrives on Chatham or San Cristobal and sees this on one of his first outings by September the 17th, he had seen what we call today the Chatham mockingbird. He noticed that this bird had the same stripe through the eye. He noticed it had patches on the stripes on the wings, had the same overall body shape, and it sang very much like the Thinka of South America. He pulls out his pocket notebook, and remembering that Thinka is the word for mockingbird, in his pocket notebook, he writes, the Thinka are very tame and curious in these isles. I certainly recognize South America in ornithology. Would a botanist? Whoa, is this spectacular for a 26-year-old guy who's coming onto these islands in his first days, and he's recognizing South America in ornithology because the mockingbird is so similar. The Chatham mockingbird is so similar to the Chilean mockingbird. He immediately recognized the affinity with South America, the affinity of Galapagos. He went on to see the Galapagos affinity of flora and fauna with those of South America, and he later put it this way. Why should the species, which are supposed to have been created in the Galapagos archipelago and nowhere else by separate creation, bear so plain a stamp of affinity to those created in America? You should be able to expect any old thing out in the Galapagos Islands. The Thinka and Galapagos were a clear anomaly, and that Darwin found it himself right away. It was reminiscent of Falkland's foxes and the East and West Island, but much better. On Chatham Island, mockingbirds all looked very similar. They were called what Darwin called a constant, and the same was true when he visited three other islands. So here's the first island, San Cristobal. Here's the second. They went over to Charles, or Floriana, we call it today. He went to Albemarle, which is Isabella today, and James, or Santiago, and he encountered different mockingbirds. So he has the mainland mockingbird on the left in his mind. He finds the Chatham mockingbird, and he sails on to Charles, and oh my goodness, we have representatives today from Champion Islet, and you know they're repatriating, rewilding today, Floriana. But you can see that this particular mockingbird, again a mockingbird, stripe in the eye, three bands on the wings, so it's called trifasciatus, three bands on the wings as opposed to two on the others, was different from both the mainland mockingbird and, right, the Chatham mockingbird. He says, I fortunately happened to observe that the first specimens that I collected in the first two islands we visited differed from each other, and this made me pay particular attention to their collection. He says, happened to observe, happened, I want to say, it was replacement in space, much like his earlier examples, but this one he found. It wasn't that the crew told him about it. It wasn't that he reassembled the bones from the Rhea. He found this one. He was the one to observe it, and it really struck him that there was a difference between these islands. They sailed on to Albemarle and over to James, as I mentioned, and with the Charles mockingbird in mind, he finds another mockingbird on Albemarle and another mockingbird on James or Santiago Island, similar to the one on Albemarle and Isabella, plain chest, no banding or striping. In short, all four of his specimens were different from the mainland species, and three of them were different from each other. He collected these three morphs. Here's a recapitulation of the morphs he had from the California Academy of Sciences here in San Francisco. Lovely exhibit to see when it's out on display. What did Darwin make of the mockingbirds? Fortunately, he kept lots of notebooks, so he tells us. In his zoology notes in 1835, he writes this of the mockingbirds with the usual spelling mistakes. He was a terrible speller. This bird, which is so closely allied to the Thinka of Chile, not Chile, So closely allied to the think of Chile. That's an anomaly number three, right? The affinity with South America. So closely allied to the Thinka of Chile is singular from existing as varieties or distinct species in the different islands. He's wondering, are these varieties or are they distinct species? This is anomaly number two. This is the replacement in space from one island to the next. This is replacement on an island scale in the Galapagos archipelago. I have four specimens from as many islands. Each variety is constant in its own island. So what we have here in the same collection of just four birds, two anomalies in the same small collection, replacement in space and affinity. But were they distinct species? If they were, Darwin wrote, it would undermine the stability of species. Why? Well, we'll never know exactly what Darwin was thinking, but consider the mockingbird world, I'll put it, that Darwin had experienced for the 3 previous years. Mockingbirds were single species over very large areas. Look at the Finca, covered most of Chile. Look at the species over in Brazil and Uruguay, covered an enormous area. And they get out to the Galapagos, where there's a world of tiny ranges, one species per island. What a striking difference from San Cristobal to Floriana, from San Cristobal to from Chatham to Charles. He did not go to Hispaniola, but we know there's a different species there today. And then the other two that he saw were similar, were from this other area. Well, mockingbirds weren't the only clue questioning the stability of species. Darwin collected even more finches, not just four. He collected 31 of them and even more diverse finches, but to Darwin, these were in inexplicable confusion. They only came to be called Darwin's finches 100 years later or so. He neglected to note which island where each one was collected, so there was no hope of showing replacement differences between islands, how one replaced the other, which there was in the simple case of the mockingbirds. So they became his best example, replacement in space of one species by another. The earlier examples were reported by others. This example was his, and it was striking. You don't have to have the red lava of Rabida Island to make the point, but it does help. Shortly after Galapagos, Darwin compiled candidate replacements of other specimens that he'd had. Here's the guanaco replacing the vicuña. Here's the Falkland fox replacing the common one on the mainland. Here, just a partial list of all the replacements he identified. He was very impressed by this thesis of replacement in space and in time from the fossils and in space by the specimens he observed in South America. But were the mockingbirds distinct species on the different islands? The beagle returned to England. Darwin sought help from the experts, Joe Hooker on plants, John Gould on birds, Richard Owen on fossil mammals. Gould scrutinized Darwin mockingbirds and pronounced, Charles, these are 3 new species of mockingbirds. And he named them and drew them, and they were not just varieties. How sure was Gould? Darwin pressed him on the matter, and he convinced Darwin that if, quote, birds so different as Trifasciatus and Parvulus, the last two different morphs that Darwin found, can be considered as varieties of one species, then the experience of all the best ornithologists must be given up. This is John Gould, the world's leading bird expert, at least in the British Empire. All the best ornithology must be given up. Darwin was convinced. There were different species from the different islands. This makes the mockingbirds Darwin's strongest case of replacement. As he said, the habits of these 3 species of mockingbird are similar. They replace each other in the natural economy of the different islands. He got nowhere with the finches, even though John Gould told him he had 13 different new species. It was really Hooker's help with plants that helped him show replacement. Joe Hooker at the Kew Botanical Garden looked over Darwin's 200 plant species eventually, where he recorded their island sources because the plants have to be pressed quickly. More than half of all the species were unique to Galapagos, and 3/4 of the species were confined to a single island. Darwin said, how wonderfully they support my assertion on replacement in space, the differences in the animals of the different islands. Now, there are 2 different ways one might explain these observations. Perhaps the creator saw Galapagos as a test bed, a place to experiment with unusual forms and have them replace each other in space. It's a test bed. It's a place the creator had fun. But why then the South American similarity? Darwin said, oh, perhaps some natural process did the same thing, generating novel forms repeatedly from a South American start, replacing one another across natural barriers. And this led to the very famous drawing on March 1837 in Notebook B, 1 month after his meeting with Gould, when he learns that the mockingbirds are different species. He says, I think one species would be modified for different ends in different environments, different places with some separation between them. and thus genera would be formed bearing relation. This is the first tree of life diagram in March of 1837. In that same notebook, 7 pages later, Darwin says, "Heaven knows whether this agrees with nature. Cuidado." He always wrote to himself in Spanish when he wanted to have special attention. He later wrote about the logic. "I often ask myself how these many peculiar Galapagos animal and plants have been produced. The simplest answer seemed to be that the inhabitants of the several islands had descended from each other, undergoing modification in the course of their descent, and that all the inhabitants of the archipelago had descended from those of the nearest land, namely America, whence colonists would naturally have been derived, thus generating a branching tree pattern, as we saw on that first tree." Well, I'm going to finish this morning with two implications. First, back to the Fuegians, and then a far-reaching conclusion that is worth remembering on this day, November the 24th. Earlier, we said that Fuegians convinced Darwin of the underlying biological similarity of all humans. The Fuegians' cultural shifts were especially compelling that culture comes and goes, but Darwin's own gut reaction to slavery experiences was very convincing of this underlying biological similarity with cultural replacement on top, led him to the view that we're all one species with a recent common origin. So that in Darwin in 1868, reading Mivart's work on the skeletal similarity of the primates, Darwin drew a primate tree after reading Mivart, clearly labeled primates and clearly showing a common origin to all of humans. This says man up here at the top. All humans are related by descent to one common origin with the primates, and you can see there's langurs and gibbons and orangutans and gorillas and chimpanzees on his tree. This is in 1868. More generally, Darwin recognized that in time, the branching pattern would not only generate genus from the splitting of one species that came in, it would generate families as a cluster of related genera. It would create an order as a cluster of related families. It would create a class of related orders, and so on. In short, the Linnaean classification system is founded on Darwin's pattern of descent with modification, the branching tree structure. But look, it works the other way around as well. The universal success of the Linnaean classification system implied that there was a common tree for all of life, leading without even any sense of genetics, DNA, or the rest of it, to Darwin's blockbuster. Probably all the organic beings which have ever lived on this earth had descended from some one primordial form into which life was first breathed. One grand system, the tree of life, encompasses all the species that have ever lived on Earth. Wow, today we know Darwin was right. Using 2.3 million extant organisms, finding no exceptions, the Open Tree of Life project, among others, shows that all the species, there's 2.3 million represented here, although the lines are so small you can't really see that many, all the way back 4.2 billion years to the last universal common ancestor. Darwin was right. There was one origin to life with no exceptions known. So there were three key steps for Darwin to conclude. His terrific luck in year one, finding megafossils at Bahia Blanca with smaller contemporary counterparts, the loss of the megafauna replaced by the small ones, suggested replacement in time. His pioneering efforts in the southern cone in year two at biogeography, the spatial patterns of species of rheas and Falklands foxes suggested replacement in space, which was confirmed in Galapagos with the mockingbirds in year four, the best example of replacement in space, and also conclusive evidence for number three, the affinity of Galapagos organisms with those of South America. There had remained, as we've seen, only one key question: were the mockingbirds distinct species, to which Gould gave a definitive yes, leading Darwin to the branching tree of descent, eventually recognizing it applied to all of life. That is, all of this led Darwin to evolution. In short, my friends, the Beagle voyage led Darwin to Galapagos and to evolution, and there's an implication for all of us. Let us all keep discovering. And that's what Darwin found convincing in Galapagos. I'm happy to take your questions this morning. I'll stop sharing my screen and we can have a discussion from here. Thank
Thank
you
you.
for your...
Oh, sorry, Bill. No, go ahead, please.
I was just thanking everybody for joining us this morning and for sharing in this wonderful day of celebration of probably the grandest idea in the natural sciences ever.
Thank you so much, Bill. What a voyage, and this was an amazing presentation. We already have questions, so I will just
Please
jump right
jump
in.
right in.
So
We
we
have some time.
can, yes, so we can cover as many as possible. Okay, so the first question comes with a little bit of a background. Greg says, I have studied Darwin's geology of the Galapagos Islands and retraced his steps in the islands and found a false narrative in biographies on Darwin that he was primarily focused on species while he was in the Galapagos. His geological notes written on the voyage provide insight into his work in the islands, as he wrote 3 times as much on the geology of Galapagos as he did on the species. His species work was primarily retrospective after the voyage. Do you consider that his geological contributions from his work in Galapagos had an influence on his thinking on evolution?
Completely and totally. There's no question about that. He recognized immediately, I think, very soon on arrival. He made a lot of contributions. The whole notion of a dike, these areas where new lava is pressed up through the old lava and so on. He recognized that the Galapagos Islands were new and volcanic in origin, and that the sea had once spread out, without interruption in the place that he was visiting. Of course, that was many, many, many years ago. We know some Galapagos Islands have been in that same area over that same hotspot for many as 30 million years. I have no doubt that the newness of the islands was a very important factor for Darwin, and that it helped him understand that the process of colonization and diversification in the flora and fauna that he went on to be fascinated by was influenced very much by the recency of the archipelago, by the adjacency of the islands, and the strong currents that predominated between them. So I think it's not an either or. I agree. Darwin was first and foremost a geologist. You can look at his book on the geology from the Voyage of the Beagle, and it's spectacular, very detailed, very complete. If anything, his zoology and botany are very incomplete and partial. Like you say, it's an afterthought. It came later. But put it this way, he did talk about, geology a lot in On the Origin of Species, but he doesn't talk much about the geology of Galapagos in The Origin of Species. He talks about the flora and fauna and how their affinity with South America suggests that it was not specially created in the Galapagos Islands. And I think it's a nifty use of his experience in Galapagos on the Origin of Species. So put it this way, my talk today was to understand how this voyage contributed to On the Origin of Species, and I chose to focus on the biology because I think that was a more direct link.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you, Bill.
Thank you.
We have
Great
another
question.
question from Michael. You have clearly described Darwin's evidence for evolution. What about natural selection?
You have another 50 minutes? I'd be happy to do it. I'm really
Next,
fascinated by
next
this.
webinar. Next webinar.
I love this because this is where Alfred Russel Wallace comes into the picture, because he was co-discoverer of natural selection. Both of them were inspired by reading Thomas Malthus on the struggle for existence that Malthus wrote about in human populations and the plight of the poor and the poor laws and feeding themselves and so on. And both Wallace in Indonesia and Darwin in Galapagos and subsequently were very influenced by, well, not in Galapagos. Darwin read Malthus much later, not much later, but just about a year later. And so they were both influenced by the same kind of background and their same experiences traveling among islands. No surprise. We recognize islands today as, great cauldrons of evolutionary change. So it's a whole fascinating story of its own. It's also a fascinating story of why we remember Darwin and not Wallace as the primary author and the primary person to whom we don't celebrate quite so seriously on Wallace's the publication date of Wallace's books, for example. And I'd be happy to do that another time. That's just too much to get into today. It's a fascinating story and natural select. So what I'm trying to say then is, let me summarize this way. Darwin first had the idea of evolution, but no mechanism to explain it. And then he came up with the mechanism, his chief agent of change, as he called it, the main but not exclusive means of modification in natural selection, and worked on that. And that way he was working away on those things when arrived this manuscript from Alfred Russel Wallace. So Darwin first had evolution. He added to that natural selection, and he started to package the two of them together. And that's why I focused only on the first one today. It's too big a story.
Mm. We actually have another question related to Wallace
Sure.
from Richard. Wallace is credited with describing biogeography, and yet it was Darwin that hinted at that years before. Why is Wallace given so much credit?
Oh no, the Wallace's discovery of the Wallace's line, the separation between the marsupials and the placentals, it is spectacular, and it's across such a short divide, a short distance between islands in Indonesia. It's quite striking. Darwin was fascinated by wombats, kangaroos, the Tasmanian devil, and all these other things that he experienced during the voyage of the Beagle, but was kind of at a loss to explain why it was this corner of the world where they were found. And then all of a sudden it switched back to placentals when he got to Mauritius, or when he sailed on to South Africa. And so it was kind of just a big question mark to Darwin. He doesn't really get into that. Darwin's biogeography discoveries were important, there's no doubt about it, but they led him to evolution rather than to something of a more biogeographical character. Wallace had a major contribution in recognizing, yeah, that the shape of this dividing line in the biota actually goes all the way back, we now understand, all the way back to the breakup of Gondwanaland and to the reshaping of the continental masses. So Wallace was onto something that was very important biogeographically and less important, I think, to understanding the immediate cause and consequence of natural selection.
Perfect. We have a question from Maria Jose, our science director. Great to see you, Bill, she says.
Great to
My
see you.
My question is, why and when did the finches come to the scene as the species that Darwin became intrigued and inspired by? You
Uh-huh.
show the mockingbirds, or those instead? Many thanks.
So Darwin, in his A Voyage of the Beagle in the 1845 edition, published a woodcut using sort of the head features of the finches, and saying to the world, well before On the Origin of Species, in The Voyage of the Beagle, 1845, one might fancy that one species had been taken and modified to different ends. So Darwin was clearly using an example that had, what would you say? It had appeal. It was simple. It was easy to do a woodcut. The difference in the mockingbirds is a little more subtle than the difference in the opening of the beaks as represented in that woodcut. So that was about as far as Darwin went with the finches, because he found them an inexplicable confusion. They were so confusing to Darwin that he called them, he said they were all on the ground. They were all ground finches, which is why John Gould called them all Geospiza as their genus. It took 100 years after Darwin before Swarth from the Cal Academy said, wait a minute, 5 or 6 of these species are tree finches and live in the canopy. Sure, they come to the ground. That's where we see them more readily. But their habitat, where they nest, where they mate, where they feed, is up in the canopy. And so Darwin was not the best observer of the finches. That's such a short period of time. 5 weeks in Galapagos is a short period of time to make sense of things. He did many wonderful things. What's noteworthy about the mockingbirds is that each type was constant, as Darwin said, on the island on which it's found. The finches were in various combinations. They were very confusing to him. He did simplify them in that one woodcut, but it was really 100 years later, and especially with Swarth and then David Lack, that the finches became associated as Darwin's finches.
Perfect, Bill. Oh, I have two more questions. Okay. David says, this was very fascinating and almost all new to me. Do you have any reading recommendations for a learner who has no professional need for the information? A primer, perhaps.
Sure. Well, Again, I buried in the beginning an article that I've written on this, which summarizes in Darwin's words. It doesn't have enough pictures and stuff. The publication was not one that was designed for publication, showing the fossils, showing some of the things we did today. Um, if you really want that kind of a more pictorial perspective, I would say any of the illustrated Voyages of the Beagle would be very good. The Voyage of the Beagle was what became of the narrative of the surveying voyages when Darwin rewrote it later for a more general audience, edited it, and then it's been illustrated subsequently with things like his fossils, with things like pictures of the finches and pictures of the mockingbirds and all those kinds of things. I think the Voyage of the Beagle is the best intro. And then you could follow that with any of the articles. I mentioned Niles Eldridge. He's got some good articles and a good book on this, on all this. But I would start with the Voyage of the Beagle, an illustrated version. There's several really good ones available.
Voyage of the Beagle, it is. One final one.
Sure.
We'll close the session. Francisco says, Bill, greetings from Galapagos. Pancho from Metro.
Greetings, Francisco. Yeah, nice to see you. Thanks for coming.
Could you please comment on the importance of Darwin meeting with Vice Governors Lawson in Charles Island and talking about giant tortoises?
Sure.
Let me go.
Um, you know, Galapagos happened very quickly for Darwin. He was whisked away, as he said, it's just isn't it the fate of the naturalist to be whisked away from a place when you're just beginning to understand and appreciate it? The vice governor, because the governor was away on the mainland, the vice governor invited Darwin to the highlands of Charles or Floriana Island, we would call it today, to visit the newly established penal colony and its agricultural activity. And Darwin was quite impressed that you could carry out some agriculture and enjoy the highlands, which have a very different climate, as you know. The humid zone has a very different climate than the arid region. That was where Darwin had spent much of his time to that point. So he was very influenced when the lieutenant governor mentioned to him that he could at once tell from which island a tortoise had been brought by the shape of the carapace. He heard this also from other people. When he visited Santiago Island, he ran into some Spaniards who told him that their experience was also that the carapaces were different in different islands, and the size of the tortoises also. They were taking them, of course, to store as food in the hulls of their ships. But Darwin didn't give much attention, didn't give much priority to that report, as he later would when he realized, oh my goodness, if the mockingbirds are different species, could this be that the tortoises are different species, or at least have the tortoises differentiated for the same kinds of reasons that the mockingbirds differentiated from island to island? In other words, it became a parallel case for him, but he didn't realize that in the islands. He realized that only later. Meanwhile, the Beagle had taken something like, I forget the numbers, but it was maybe 40 tortoises on board and eaten them and thrown the carapaces overboard. So Darwin had lots of opportunity to study carapaces, to think more about that, and the pieces weren't in place yet. I can't overemphasize how important not just the discovery that John Gould made that these were different mockingbirds, but Gould's insistence that ornithology would have to be given up if these were not different species, so that Darwin could put some credibility, we would say, into that discovery, into that finding. That was so important for Charles that he began to reinterpret so many things in light of there being different species on different islands. Suddenly the tortoises were another example of that phenomenon that he had found himself and that John Gould had definitively pronounced.
Thank you so much, Bill.
Thanks to all of you for coming today, and have a joyful
Yeah,
celebration of one of the most important books ever written.
we had a very good attendance. We will share the recording with everyone
Wonderful.
via
Thank you.
email. Also, everyone who signed up but couldn't make it. I also had some questions about your previous webinar, your first one that you did with us. So we will share that as well in the
Oh,
email.
lovely. Thank you. Thank you very
Um,
kindly. I'm happy to help anytime.
Uh,
I'm a big believer in the Charles Darwin Foundation and the wonderful work you all are doing. And so I'm only too happy to contribute.
Thank you, Bill. It's great to have you on our side as our supporter, our advocate. We're very appreciative. And I posted, like just as a little reminder, I posted a link to our campaign in the chat box. So if you felt inspired today, and we'll also share it via email, please make a contribution to the Charles Darwin Foundation this year and giving season. And for all our attendees joining from the US, happy Thanksgiving. So yeah, thank
Thank
you,
you so
everyone.
much. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining us today.
See you soon, Bill.
Until the next time.
Bye bye.
Bye.